I'm not forgetting to read the Bible, but we're going to start with something a little bit ahead of reading that together. From time to time, I like to ponder what it means to have the faith of a child, which of course means thinking about the attributes of children. And one attribute of children that comes to mind this morning is their capacity to be captivated by the same story over and over and over and over again. No matter how often we read, "Are you my mother?" our kids could get excited about a favorite character. In fact, there's a little kitten in there that has lip marks on it permanently from getting kissed time and time again as they waited for a character or a scene that never failed to make them laugh. Never mind that we had just read the same book, the day before, or an hour earlier, or for the third time in a row. They hear it each time as if it is brand new. The gospel story is one that we may have heard dozens, if not hundreds of times. And I wonder how many of us get caught up in the excitement and emotion of such a familiar drama when we know the ending so well. Do we wait with anticipation for characters and events that thrill or delight or amuse or appall us? And I wonder if we're so familiar that we end up missing a small part of the story. So I invite you to listen to this little bit of the Gospel of John this morning and try listening as if you'd never heard it before. Then they took Jesus from the high priest Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters. It was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the headquarters so as to avoid ritual defilement and be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews replied, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill what Jesus had said when he indicated the kind of death he was to die. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king? For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked him, "What is truth?" After he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no case against him. But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" They shouted in reply, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a bandit. Word of God, word of life. Thanks be to God. So as you listen, do you feel the mounting tension, the looming threat, the evil? Did you notice the physical movement in the story, or sense the depth of Pilate's torment? It's worth taking a little time to rebuild the drama for ourselves so that by the time we get to the decision about Barabbas, we can grasp more deeply the full meaning of that tragic choice. Excuse me. So let's begin with Pilate. Pilate is a regional governor appointed by Rome, and he spends most of his time in the coastal city of Caesarea Maritima, where his palace, a fine palace, is small compensation for getting assigned to a backwater of the Roman Empire. But Pilate would still rather be there than here in Jerusalem. Pilate probably doesn't care much one way or the other about the people of Israel, but he has learned something about governing. People are easier to govern when they can practice their faith. People are easier to govern when they can practice their faith. Passovers and Sabbaths mean nothing to Pilate, but he knows that if you let the people do their thing, they will give you less trouble. This, however, does not mean that the people of Israel are a docile group. And that's the second thing we miss in this story. In our mind's eye, we may be inclined to paint a bucolic picture of life in gospel times. Fishermen out on sparkling blue waters, casting their nets as they laugh and call to one another from boat to boat. Women good-naturedly gathering to exchange gossip at the well as they collect jugs of cool, clear water. The comforting smell of bread baking, neatly swept walks and pots of flowers here and there, children running in happy games. Our imaginations are shaped by the illustrations in our family Bibles, by Sunday school take-home sheets, by Hollywood. And there are snippets of truth in those images. But there was also a great deal of tension and unrest as people chafed under Roman oppression. People worked hard to scrape together meager daily bread. Water was heavy and had to be fetched twice daily. High infant mortality rates cast a pall of familiar grief over households. Freedoms were sorely limited, and grinding poverty, crushing taxation were daily realities. It would be a mistake to say that either picture is complete. Life in first century Palestine was multidimensional. People celebrated and they labored. People loved and they bickered. Untimely death sat alongside crowded dinner tables. People were faithful and they were faithless. They helped their neighbors and they ripped them off, all under harsh and oppressive Roman rule. So this helps set the stage for the energy in Jerusalem over the Passover. Remember, the Passover holiday is a celebration of God helping people overthrow an oppressive king. There's irony throughout the Gospel of John, and people gather for this holiday to celebrate God helping them overthrow an oppressive king, and they gather in boisterous protest, and they gather in raucous celebration, and tensions mount as the crush of people swarms in from the countryside to bring their offerings to the Jerusalem temple. Pilate does not want to be there, but he has to be there, and his soldiers with him. If things get out of hand in Jerusalem, on Pilate's head it will be, because Pilate answers to the emperor. And that is our scene. And this time, the rowdy crowd includes the rabble following Jesus, that guy who is making blasphemous claims to be the Son of God, stirring up a cauldron that is already at a simmer. Pilate does not want to be there, but he heaves a sigh and goes outside when the leaders arrive at his headquarters and throw Jesus at his feet. Pilate has apparently heard something of Jesus, but seems to think Jesus is no one he needs to be concerned with. So Pilate tells the priests to manage him themselves. But the religious leaders are insistent. Pilate does not want to be there, but the tensions are running high and higher, and now crowds are gathering around what might have started as a smaller exchange between Pilate and the religious leaders. So Pilate goes back inside and questions Jesus. Your own priests have handed you over to me. What have you done? And Jesus starts talking about a kingdom that is not from this world. And then Jesus says, "For this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." And here is a moment of light in the middle of a dark and evil tale. John, the gospel writer, uses the word truth more than any other gospel writer combined. It runs through his gospel like a stream. Beginning in the prologue, the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus is the true bread and the true light, and those who belong to the truth listen to his voice. John also tells us who listened. At the wedding in Cana, when Mary said to the servants, "Listen to him," the blind man listened. Lazarus listened when Jesus called, "Come out." Mary Magdalene will listen in the garden outside the empty tomb. Those who belong to the truth listen to Jesus' voice. So what does it mean to belong to the truth? It means to belong to Jesus, the true bread, the true light, the life, the good shepherd. We who belong to Jesus, we know his voice and we belong to the truth. Pilate asks the wrong question. It's not what is the truth, it's who is truth. John reminds us who the truth is. John reminds us that Jesus bears testimony to God's truth, God's grace, and God's love in his words and in his body. John creates for us a moment of holy light in the middle of a dark and tense tale. Remember Pilate pacing in and out, religious leaders snarling for blood, the crowd growing agitated, eager for spectacle, soldiers lurking in the shadows, the whip cracking in the courtyard. John skillfully crafts anxious darkness, and then John reminds us whose voice it is we hear in our own anxious darkness. But poor Pilate doesn't see the light and has only a sense of the truth, and he remains confused, and he steps outside again, and he asks the leaders, "I find no charge against Jesus. What do you want me to do?" And they call for the release of Barabbas the bandit. The only other place in the Gospel of John that mentions bandits is when Jesus speaks of the Good Shepherd. Listen, Jesus says, "Very truly I tell you, anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the gate, but climbs in by another way, is a thief and a bandit. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. But rather than the good shepherd, whose voice they don't know, the leaders call for the release of Barabbas. Barabbas, whose name means son of the Father. Barabbas, the bandit. It bears remembering that in John, when we hear the phrase, the Jews. John is not talking about a people of faith the way we would talk about Jews now. John is referring to the religious leaders of that very particular time. And the religious leaders are the ones who haul Jesus before Pilate, thinking they can avoid defilement while calling for his death. And the leaders call for the wrong son of the wrong father. Here in this place, we gather in the name of the Son of God, the Word made flesh, dwelling among us, full of grace and truth. The Word made flesh is indeed true light in our own anxious darkness. And we know his voice. Even if we miss it from time to time, even if we don't want to listen, we know the voice of Jesus. A voice speaking into our lives with forgiveness and grace. A voice speaking through the church with welcome and belonging. A voice speaking through people in service with hope and acceptance. When you hear the words of forgiveness from the font, when you hear the words of welcome to the table, when you hear the Bible read, when you hear the voice of love in a dim and lonely place, you are hearing the voice of truth, the voice that gives life to darkness. Rejoice then and be glad. Amen.